In today's video, we are returning to Intellia Therapeutics, who on February 28th were able to provide us remarkable updates related to their in vivo CRISPR therapy for the treatment of transthyretin amyloidosis.
Although I have a PhD in biomedical engineering and over 15 years of working experience in the healthcare industry, I do not intend to give you investment advice. Please consider your own risk profile before making any investments and research your investments wisely.
Let's remind ourselves what transthyretin amyloidosis is. It is actually a rare disease, progressive and often fatal, which is linked to a protein called TTR that is actually misfolded and accumulates in the body. And this can have, depending on the type of ATT, impacts on the nervous system or the heart and digestive systems. There are two different types of transthyretin amyloidosis that we distinguish. The one is the hereditary form, actually, abbreviated ATTRV. And we also have a so-called wild type, where the protein becomes malformed for reasons that are different than the genetic mutation that we see in the hereditary form. In my previous video on Intellia Therapeutics, I had already mentioned that they were the first company to deliver an in vivo CRISPR treatment using their proprietary lipid nanoparticles. And so that means there is no gene editing done outside of the human body. It is actually really the CRISPR complex is delivered directly into the patient through an intravenous injection, and the gene editing actually takes place inside of the patient's body. The fact that we are dealing with rare disease is very well manifested in the worldwide estimated number of patients. So we see here that there are worldwide about 50,000 patients who are suffering from the inherited form of amyloidosis. And we have 200 to 500,000 patients worldwide which have the so-called wild type form of the disease, causing the abnormal folding of the ATT protein. Rare disease is synonymous with orphan drug. And if you want to brush up on what regulatory protections are awarded to companies developing orphan drugs, I leave a link here to the playlist of the Health Wealth Investor Toolkit, where you can learn more about those protections applying to orphan drugs. The source of the misfolded TTR protein is actually the liver. And we can see here nicely illustrated in this schematic how the Intellia treatment NTLA-2001 actually is being delivered to the patient. This is done through an intravenous injection, and as part of the phase 1 clinical trial they have tried different concentrations. Then the lipid nanoparticles are designed in such a way that they actually migrate to the liver to deliver the CRISPR-Cas complex, which is then ultimately achieving the inactivation of the target gene. So the production of the TTR protein is actually silenced. And this is how Intellia plan to address this rare disease. And so let's take a look at what the fantastic news and data they have shown us from the phase 1 clinical trial actually looks like. And the details are provided in the February 28 press release. We can see here that the study actually achieved a 68 and 93% mean serum TTR reduction 28 days after the administration of the intravenous lipid nanoparticles with the CRISPR-Cas complex. The concentrations that were delivered here were 0.7 milligrams per kilogram of patient body weight and 1 milligram per kilogram. Very important, I have outlined this previously, in phase 1 clinical trials, we want to see dose-dependent responses. And of course, phase 1 trials are also aimed at evaluating the safety and tolerability of the treatments being administered. So then, of course, it is one thing to impact TTR concentration in the blood over a short period of time, as these data were at 28 days post-treatment or post-infusion. But what we need and what we want is, of course, long-term data. So we see here also that there was durable TTR reductions in the patients, and we have those evidences now from 2 to 12 months post-treatment. Of course, as patients get enrolled, one after the other, there is a natural progression in the post-treatment duration and the data that's available. So that's what we see here. Also then, critically important, of course, is the tolerability and the safety. And very nice to see, high-level summary here, that the NTLA-2001 treatment was generally well tolerated at all levels that were administered. The interim data which Intellia released today are from actually 15 patients who have the hereditary form of amyloidosis. And those actually are the groups that suffer from the polyneuropathies rather than the cardiovascular problems. And those patients, well, this is ultimately a subgroup, of course, those patients were treated with different concentrations of the NTLA-2001 treatment, namely ranging from 0.1 milligram per kilogram, 0.3, 0.7, up to 1 milligram per kilogram. As I had mentioned before, the treatment is administered intravenously via an infusion, and the data shows a reduction of the ATTR, of the TTR protein by 28 days post-treatment. The dose-dependent response in the reduction of the TTR protein were 52%, corresponding to the 0.1 milligram per kilogram concentration, an 87% reduction of TTR protein at the 0.3 milligram per kilogram, and a 86% reduction for the 0.7 milligram per kilogram dose groups. And then there was a 93% reduction in the 1 milligram per kilogram dose group. So a clear dose-dependent response. These mean serum reductions of TTR protein were durable over the available time frame, as mentioned previously, which is from 2 to 12 months post-treatment. This is ultimately the opening of a new era of medicine. Now, you all know that CRISPR-based gene editing is still a relatively novel technology. Most of the treatment modalities that are in clinical trials right now employ ex vivo gene editing, which means that cells are removed from the patient's body, modified using CRISPR-Cas9 outside of the body, and then after sufficient quality control are then reinfused. But Intellia is really making this as an in vivo treatment. The stakes are potentially, of course, much higher, because you absolutely need to ensure that the gene editing is done in the right target and without any off-target gene edits. But the data and the results that they have obtained really speak to the feasibility and actually really hold much promise for these kinds of programs, where a single treatment can actually provide a cure, hopefully for the lifetime of the patient. Right now, of course, we have data up to 12 months, but it looks very promising. So these promising results from this particular study as, well, proof of concept, of course, also further validates the use of this type of CRISPR technology platforms developed by Intellia for continued development in genome editing approaches for, of course, other diseases. And Intellia, in my opinion, is really well positioned also with regards to their clinical pipeline. The safety profile data that is provided by Intellia also looks very promising. At all the 4 dose levels outlined previously, the treatment was well tolerated. There were 11 mild adverse events, such as headache, infusion-related reactions, back pain, rash, and nausea. And there were essentially no, well, significant liver findings, which is very important because the gene editing, as you have learned, is taking place actually in the liver. Most of the time, adverse events are a function of the administered dose. So, as per the study protocol, the highest dose group was actually expanded from 3 to 6 patients in order to study at this highest level the safety profile in more detail. And what we learn here is that there were no higher related than grade 2 adverse events reported for these patients in this highest dose cohort, and that just substantiates that the treatment inherently is very safe and has only mild side effects. This phase 1 study of NTLA-2001 is actually planned as 2 distinct phases. The first phase, well, we just had the interim data, but part 2 of this phase 1 study will then be a single dose of patients with polyneuropathy, and these expansion cohorts will then begin the treatments in the first quarter expected of 2022, and they will receive a proposed dose of 80 milligrams per kilogram, pending, of course, regulatory feedback on this. Looking at the clinical trial protocol, we can see that overall in the study there will be 74 patients going to be enrolled, and there are actually the 2 different, subgroups or subtypes of the disease. We are dealing with the first group, which is the polyneuropathy patient group, and then we have the second group, which basically have the cardiomyopathy as the manifestation of the disease. For both of these groups, there are 2 parts. The first part consists of the open-label ascending dose study, from which we have now just seen interim data. And we can see that for both subgroups there is a part 2, if applicable, and that is the dose expansion study that we have just looked at, proposed at 80 milligrams. And also here is the dose expansion study as well. So how does this look like concretely? In the cardiomyopathy arm, so the single ascending dose was 0.7 and 1 milligram per kilogram. And you can see here that the expansion cohort will then be 12 patients. For the polyneuropathy arm or group, we had the different dosings as outlined here. And then the single dose expansion study cohort with 0.8 milligrams, so it's just below or between those 2 doses here, will involve 8 patients who are being dosed at 0.8 milligrams per kilogram. Now, in terms of the stock price, if we take a look at what happened actually back in June, when Intellia had the first announcement of the dosing of the first 6 patients in vivo with their CRISPR treatment, the stock price jumped from $76 all the way up to the peak of $171, which is really quite a jump. So definitely I expect that based on the news which was shared actually yesterday as the recording of this video, that there will indeed be another impact on the stock price. Will it be as substantial as the first time around? I don't know. We can see here basically the close following the announcements yesterday. Not that much movement, but nevertheless, I would expect that this is a catalyst, and that if not at market opening today on the 1st of March 2022, but perhaps over the next few days, we should see definitely a rebound or refound interest in the Intellia Therapeutics stock, which has the ticker symbol NTLA. And perhaps, as we have kind of seen actually last summer as well, these fantastic groundbreaking results could also spur again more interest into the broader market of the gene editing companies. Let's see. Let me know what you think of these fantastic data that have been presented by Intellia today. What do you think are the impacts for the gene editing companies at large? And what is the future of in vivo gene editing? If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to my channel.